William Ewart Gladstone was born in 1809 into a family that stood at the intersection of wealth, commerce, and political ambition. His father was a successful merchant whose fortune had been built through international trade, giving the household financial security and access to elite social circles. This background placed young Gladstone within Britain's rising commercial aristocracy, a class that valued discipline, reputation, and public respectability. From an early age, he grew up surrounded by discussions of duty, order, and national interest, absorbing the idea that personal success carried obligations beyond private life. Gladstone's childhood environment was marked by strict moral expectations and a strong sense of hierarchy. Religion played a central role in family life, shaping his early understanding of right and wrong. He was taught to view discipline as a virtue and self-control as a mark of character. These influences did not produce a carefree youth. Instead, they formed a serious, inward-looking child who learned early to measure his actions against ethical standards. Even in boyhood, Gladstone displayed an intensity that set him apart, less drawn to ease or play than to reflection, structure, and achievement. His formal education reinforced these traits. Sent to elite schools, Gladstone was immersed in classical learning, where Latin and Greek texts dominated intellectual life. This training did more than sharpen his memory or language skills. It introduced him to ancient ideas of virtue, governance, and civic responsibility. He excelled academically, developing habits of precision, rigorous argument, and deep concentration. Teachers and peers alike noted his exceptional discipline and ambition, along with a seriousness that suggested he already saw education as preparation for a larger purpose. By the time Gladstone entered early adulthood in the late 1820s, the foundations of his character were firmly set. He emerged from his formative years shaped by privilege, faith, and intellectual rigour, yet also burdened by high expectations, both imposed and self-created. These early experiences did not yet reveal the reformer he would become, but they forged the internal framework that would guide him through decades of political transformation. His family background and early life produced not a finished statesman, but a deeply prepared one, a young man trained to believe that power, knowledge, and morality were inseparable, and that public life was ultimately a test of conscience as much as ability. William Ewart Gladstone's education at Eaton and Oxford formed the intellectual and moral core of his future public life. These were not merely prestigious institutions, they were environments designed to shape Britain's governing class. For Gladstone, entry into Eton marked a decisive break from the sheltered discipline of home and an immersion into a competitive world where intellect, endurance, and character were constantly tested. The school's traditions emphasised leadership through learning, and Gladstone quickly distinguished himself through seriousness rather than charm, earning a reputation for intense focus and exceptional academic commitment. At Eton, classical education dominated daily life. Latin and Greek were not simply subjects but disciplines that trained the mind in logic, structure, and persuasion. Gladstone absorbed ancient texts with unusual depth, finding in them moral and political lessons that resonated strongly with his religious upbringing. Unlike many of his peers, who treated classics as a stepping stone to status, he approached them with near reverence. This combination of faith and classical thought began to fuse into a distinctive worldview, one that linked personal morality with public responsibility. Even as a schoolboy, Gladstone showed signs of the inward intensity that would later define his political style. Oxford University elevated these tendencies to a higher level. Entering Christ Church, Gladstone found himself in an environment where intellectual excellence and ambition were openly rewarded. He excelled in debates, essays, and examinations, eventually achieving one of the highest academic distinctions available. Oxford sharpened his command of argument and reinforced his belief that ideas mattered deeply in shaping society. He immersed himself in philosophy, theology, and history, developing a disciplined method of reasoning that allowed him to argue complex positions with precision and confidence. This was not passive learning, it was preparation for leadership grounded in intellect. By the time Gladstone completed his studies, Eaton and Oxford had done more than educate him, they had shaped his identity. He emerged convinced that public life demanded intellectual seriousness and moral integrity in equal measure. The habits formed during these years, rigorous study, ethical self-examination, and respect for structured argument, would remain with him throughout his long political career. His education did not produce a ready-made reformer, but it forged a statesman who believed that governance was an extension of moral duty, and that ideas, when carefully developed and responsibly applied, could change the course of a nation. William Ewart Gladstone's early intellectual and religious influences formed the inner framework that guided his entire public life. Long before he became a national figure, his mind was shaped by a powerful sense that belief and thought were inseparable. Religion was not simply a private comfort for him, it was a lens through which history, politics, and human responsibility were interpreted. This outlook gave his thinking a seriousness that distinguished him from many contemporaries who treated faith as tradition rather than conviction. At the centre of these influences stood Anglican Christianity, absorbed not passively but with intense personal engagement. Gladstone approached religion as a discipline of the mind as much as of the soul. He read theological works with the same rigour he applied to classical texts, seeking coherence, moral order, and meaning. Scripture, doctrine, and church history were studied not for reassurance, but for guidance on how power should be exercised and restrained. This habit fostered a lifelong belief that political authority carried moral consequences, and that leaders were accountable not only to voters or institutions, but to higher ethical standards. Alongside religion, classical thought played a decisive role in shaping his intellectual character. Ancient writers introduced him to ideas of virtue, duty, and civic obligation that resonated deeply with his faith. Rather than seeing ancient philosophy and Christianity as opposing forces, Gladstone treated them as complementary traditions that reinforced one another. From this synthesis emerged a worldview in which moral self-discipline was the foundation of public service. He came to believe that societies declined not because of weak institutions alone, but because of weakened character among those who governed them. These early influences also encouraged a habit of introspection that would define Gladstone's personality. He constantly examined his own motives, beliefs, and actions, measuring them against moral ideals he knew he could never fully satisfy. This self-scrutiny made him both resilient and vulnerable. Resilient because he acted from conviction rather than impulse. Vulnerable because doubt and moral conflict were constant companions. Yet it was precisely this inner struggle that gave his public life its depth. Gladstone did not enter politics as a strategist seeking advantage, but as a thinker convinced that ideas, faith, and conscience must shape power. The roots of that conviction lay firmly in these early intellectual and religious influences, which continued to guide him long after circumstances changed and certainty became harder to maintain. William Ewart Gladstone entered Parliament at a remarkably young age, carrying with him not only ambition but a fully formed sense of moral purpose. His arrival in the House of Commons was not theatrical or rebellious, it was disciplined, deliberate, and respectful of tradition. Gladstone saw Parliament as a serious institution entrusted with safeguarding order, faith, and social stability. In these early years, he did not seek to overturn the existing system, but to serve it faithfully, believing that continuity was a virtue and that change, if it came at all, must be cautious and principled. His early conservatism was rooted less in party loyalty than in conviction. Gladstone believed that the established church, the constitution, and inherited social structures formed the moral backbone of the nation. He feared that rapid reform would weaken these foundations and unleash disorder disguised as progress. In his early speeches, he defended authority, hierarchy, and religious tradition with intellectual intensity. Rather than appealing to popular emotion, he addressed Parliament with dense, carefully reasoned arguments, demonstrating a seriousness that earned respect even from political opponents. This phase of his career revealed a striking feature of Gladstone's character: his willingness to bind politics to conscience. He did not treat conservatism as a convenient position, but as a moral duty shaped by his understanding of history and faith. Government, in his view, existed to preserve moral order as much as to manage policy. As a result, his early parliamentary interventions often focused on issues of principle rather than immediate advantage. He spoke as if political error carried ethical consequences, and this approach gave his conservatism an intensity that set him apart from more pragmatic colleagues. Yet even within this conservative framework, signs of future transformation were already present. Gladstone listened closely to debate, absorbed criticism, and reflected deeply on opposing arguments. He did not dismiss dissent, he studied it. His early years in Parliament were therefore not static, but formative, a testing ground where belief met experience. While he began his career as a defender of tradition, he was already developing the habit that would later define him: the readiness to revise his political positions when conscience and reason demanded it. Entry into Parliament did not fix Gladstone's identity. It began a long process of moral and political evolution that would reshape British politics for generations. William Ewart Gladstone's association with the Peelites marked one of the most decisive turning points in his political life, signalling a gradual but irreversible break with traditional Toryism. This shift did not come through rebellion or ambition, but through conflict between loyalty and conviction. As the Conservative Party fractured over economic policy and the role of the state, Gladstone found himself increasingly aligned with those who believed that rigid adherence to tradition could no longer address the realities of a changing society. The Peelites were not revolutionaries. They were reformers driven by administrative competence, economic rationality, and moral seriousness. At the heart of this division stood Sir Robert Peel's commitment to free trade and economic modernisation, particularly in the controversial repeal of protectionist policies. For Gladstone, supporting Peel was not simply a policy choice but a moral one. He came to believe that government had a duty to act in the broader national interest, even when doing so alienated established supporters. This position placed him at odds with traditional Toryism, which emphasised agricultural protection, landed influence, and party unity. By siding with Peel, Gladstone accepted political isolation in exchange for intellectual honesty, a decision that reshaped both his career and his reputation. The Peelite period tested Gladstone's capacity for independence more than any earlier phase of his life. He was no longer sheltered by a unified party identity, nor could he rely on inherited loyalties for support. Instead, he operated within a loose coalition defined more by principles than by structure. This experience sharpened his understanding of politics as a moral practice rather than a tribal one. It also forced him to confront the cost of integrity in public life, diminished influence in the short term, but increased credibility in the long run. The break with traditional Toryism did not immediately transform Gladstone into a liberal reformer, but it set him firmly on that path. The Peelites represented a transitional space between old conservatism and emerging liberalism, where Gladstone learned to reconcile governance with conscience. In leaving behind rigid party orthodoxy, he gained something more enduring: the freedom to evolve. This moment of separation was not an ending, but a reorientation, one that allowed Gladstone to redefine his political identity and prepare for the far-reaching reforms that would later define his legacy. William Ewart Gladstone's first experience in government office marked the moment when theory met responsibility. Until then, his reputation had been built on intellect, principle, and parliamentary performance. office forced a different discipline. Decisions now carried immediate consequences, budgets had limits, and ideals had to survive contact with administration. For Gladstone, entering government was not a reward for loyalty but a test of character, an arena where moral intention would be judged by practical outcome. In his early ministerial roles, Gladstone encountered the machinery of the state at close range. Files replaced speeches, procedures replaced debate. He learned how policy was slowed, reshaped, or quietly redirected by institutional habit. This exposure did not dull his idealism, but it refined it. He became acutely aware that good intentions could fail without careful execution, and that reform required patience as much as conviction. Administration demanded precision, and Gladstone responded with relentless attention to detail, often exhausting colleagues with his intensity and insistence on correctness. These early offices also deepened his understanding of fiscal responsibility and public trust. Gladstone came to see government finance not as technical bookkeeping, but as a moral contract between state and citizen. Waste, inefficiency, or careless spending were not merely administrative failures, they were ethical ones. This belief began to shape his distinctive approach to governance, where economy and accountability were treated as virtues rather than constraints. His time in office trained him to think of power as stewardship, temporary, conditional, and answerable. Perhaps most importantly, his first experience in government reshaped his sense of leadership. Gladstone learned that authority did not flow automatically from intellect or eloquence. It had to be earned through consistency, discipline, and responsibility under pressure. Mistakes were unavoidable, criticism constant, and compromise unavoidable. Yet he emerged from this period strengthened rather than diminished. Office did not silence his conscience, it disciplined it. By the time he left his earliest governmental roles, Gladstone was no longer simply a brilliant parliamentarian. He had become a governing mind, prepared for the far heavier responsibilities that lay ahead. William Ewart Gladstone's rise as Chancellor of the Exchequer marked the moment when his political identity crystallised around finance, morality, and public trust. This was not a sudden elevation, but the result of years spent absorbing the discipline of administration and the consequences of policy. When he assumed responsibility for the nation's finances, Gladstone approached the office with an almost austere seriousness. The budget, in his view, was not merely an economic instrument, it was a moral document, revealing how a government understood its obligations to the people it served. Gladstone's approach to the Exchequer was defined by clarity and restraint. He believed that taxation should be transparent, limited, and justified, and that public money demanded the same respect as private earnings. His budgets were carefully constructed, explained in exhaustive detail, and delivered with intellectual intensity that transformed financial statements into major political events. Audiences inside and outside Parliament listened not only to figures, but to arguments about fairness, responsibility, and national character. Through these performances, Gladstone reshaped the role of Chancellor into one of public educator as much as financial manager. Central to his reputation was his commitment to balanced budgets and fiscal discipline. Gladstone argued that government debt was a burden placed on future generations without their consent, and he treated financial prudence as an ethical duty. At the same time, he supported reductions in indirect taxation that weighed heavily on ordinary citizens, believing that economic relief strengthened both prosperity and moral independence. This combination, strict control of expenditure alongside selective tax reform, gave his financial leadership a coherence that appealed across social divisions, even when it provoked resistance from vested interests. By the end of his rise as Chancellor, Gladstone had become one of the most commanding figures in British public life. His mastery of finance enhanced his authority far beyond economic policy, reinforcing the perception that he governed through principle rather than convenience. The Exchequer became the platform from which he demonstrated that morality and efficiency were not rivals, but partners in responsible government. This period did more than elevate his career. It defined a standard of fiscal leadership that would shape debates about governance, accountability, and public trust long after his time in office had passed. William Ewart Gladstone's commitment to economic liberalism found its clearest expression in the budgets he crafted and defended with relentless precision. For Gladstone, liberal economics was not a slogan about markets alone. It was a disciplined philosophy about freedom, responsibility, and restraint. He believed that individuals flourished best when the state limited its reach, taxed only what was necessary, and interfered as little as possible in productive life. Budget reform thus became his primary instrument for translating abstract principles into tangible policy. Central to this vision was the conviction that taxation should be light, intelligible, and morally defensible. Gladstone sought to dismantle complex and hidden taxes that burdened everyday consumption, arguing that such levies punished the poor disproportionately and distorted economic behaviour. By reducing duties on basic goods and simplifying revenue streams, he aimed to restore a direct relationship between the citizen and the state, one in which people could clearly see what they paid and why. Transparency, in his view, was a safeguard against waste and corruption, and an essential condition for public trust. Gladstone's budgets also reflected a broader belief in free trade as a force for national prosperity and international stability. He argued that open markets encouraged efficiency, lowered prices, and reduced the risk of conflict between nations tied together by commerce. Yet his support for free trade was never reckless. He paired openness with strict expenditure control, insisting that economic growth should not become an excuse for fiscal excess. Growth, he believed, had to be earned through discipline, not borrowed through debt. What made Gladstone's budget reforms distinctive was their ethical framing. He presented economic liberalism as a form of moral governance, one that respected the independence of citizens and resisted the temptation to rule through financial manipulation. Each budget speech became a lesson in civic responsibility, reminding Parliament that prosperity without prudence was fragile, and freedom without accountability hollow. Through these reforms, Gladstone did more than reshape Britain's finances. He embedded economic liberalism into the political culture as a serious, principled alternative to both protectionism and state expansion. William Ewart Gladstone's transformation into a liberal leader was neither sudden nor theatrical. It unfolded slowly, shaped by experience, reflection, and a growing tension between inherited loyalties and moral judgment. Gladstone did not abandon conservatism because it became unpopular. He moved beyond it because it no longer answered the questions he believed politics was obliged to confront. This transformation was deeply personal. It reflected a man wrestling with the limits of tradition in a society undergoing profound economic, social, and political change. What distinguished Gladstone's shift was the role of conscience over calculation. As he encountered the realities of governance, poverty, inequality, and the uneven burdens of the state, he began to reassess the moral foundations of authority. Liberalism, to him, was not a creed of disruption, but of responsibility. He came to believe that government existed to remove unjust constraints rather than preserve inherited privilege, and that liberty was meaningful only when paired with fairness. This evolving conviction pushed him toward causes he once viewed with suspicion, including expanded political participation and reform of entrenched institutions. Public leadership demanded that this inner transformation become visible. Gladstone's speeches increasingly reflected a new tone, less defensive of established power, more attentive to the moral claims of the governed. He addressed the electorate not as subjects to be guided, but as citizens capable of judgment and responsibility. This approach reshaped his relationship with the public. He no longer relied solely on parliamentary authority. He appealed directly to national conscience. In doing so, He helped redefine liberal leadership as a partnership between moral argument and democratic engagement. By the time Gladstone was fully recognised as a liberal leader, the transformation was complete, but never static. He did not present liberalism as a finished doctrine, but as an ongoing ethical task. His leadership rested on the belief that political positions must remain answerable to reason, experience, and moral scrutiny. This willingness to evolve, while remaining anchored in principle, became his defining strength. Gladstone's transformation was not a rejection of his past, but its reworking. A long journey from inherited certainty to chosen conviction, one that reshaped British liberalism and set a standard for leadership grounded in conscience rather than convenience. William Ewart Gladstone's first term as Prime Minister marked the moment when a long intellectual journey finally translated into national leadership. When he assumed office, expectations were immense. Gladstone was not entering government as a compromise figure or party manager, but as a statesman associated with moral seriousness, reform, and disciplined governance. His premiership began with a clear sense of purpose. The state, he believed, existed to remove injustice, restrain unnecessary power, and expand moral responsibility rather than authority for its own sake. From the outset, Gladstone treated leadership as an ethical obligation rather than a display of command. His government moved swiftly to address long-standing institutional problems, particularly those rooted in privilege and inefficiency. Reform was not framed as revolution, but as moral correction. He believed that outdated structures weakened the legitimacy of the state and eroded public trust. His approach emphasized legality, fairness, and accountability, seeking to align public institutions more closely with the principles of equality before the law. This methodical pace frustrated radicals and conservatives alike, yet it reflected Gladstone's conviction that lasting change required careful construction rather than dramatic gestures. Gladstone's leadership style during this first term was demanding, both for himself and for those around him. He immersed himself deeply in policy detail, often dominating cabinet discussions with exhaustive argument and moral reasoning. Ministers found him inspiring but exhausting. Opposition figures found him formidable rather than charismatic. He did not govern through personal charm but through intellectual authority and ethical persistence. Parliament became the central arena of his power, where his speeches, dense, passionate and relentless, sought not only to win votes, but to shape conscience. By the end of his first term, Gladstone had fundamentally altered expectations of what a Prime Minister could be. He showed that leadership could be rooted in principle without abandoning practicality, and that reform could proceed without dismantling constitutional order. Success was uneven, resistance constant, and compromises unavoidable. Yet his first premiership established a model of moral governance that would define his career and influence British political culture for decades. Gladstone did not promise perfection, he promised responsibility. In doing so, he transformed the office of Prime Minister from a position of management into a platform for ethical leadership, setting a standard few could match, and many would debate long after his departure. William Ewart Gladstone's engagement with the Irish question became the most emotionally charged and politically dangerous chapter of his career. Unlike earlier reforms, Ireland could not be addressed through administrative efficiency alone. It demanded a confrontation with history, identity, and mistrust accumulated over centuries. Gladstone came to believe that the stability of the United Kingdom depended not on tighter control over Ireland, but on a redefinition of its relationship with the British state. This conviction placed him at odds not only with his opponents, but with large sections of his own political allies. At the core of Gladstone's thinking was a moral diagnosis. He argued that Ireland was not inherently ungovernable, but had been misgoverned. Economic hardship, religious inequality, and political exclusion had created a society where loyalty to the state could not take root. For Gladstone, coercion was not a solution, but a confession of failure. He believed that order imposed without consent would always be temporary. This belief pushed him toward policies aimed at justice rather than suppression, even when such positions exposed him to fierce criticism. Home Rule emerged from this reasoning as both a political and ethical proposal. Gladstone did not frame it as separation, but as self-government within the existing union. He argued that allowing Ireland control over its domestic affairs would reduce tension, strengthen loyalty, and remove the constant need for emergency measures. This was a radical departure from traditional British policy, and it shattered established political alignments. Supporters hailed it as an act of moral courage. Opponents denounced it as a threat to national unity. The debate over Home Rule became a test not just of policy, but of how the British state understood sovereignty and trust. The struggle over Ireland ultimately reshaped Gladstone's legacy. His Home Rule efforts failed legislatively in his lifetime, but they transformed the terms of debate permanently. He forced Britain to confront the limits of centralised authority and the cost of ruling without consent. In championing the Irish cause, Gladstone accepted division, defeat, and personal isolation in exchange for consistency with his principles. The Irish question revealed both the strength and vulnerability of his leadership, strength in moral clarity, vulnerability in political consequence. Yet it ensured that his career would be remembered not only for reform, but for the willingness to stake power itself on the belief that justice, even when rejected, was worth pursuing. William Ewart Gladstone's approach to foreign policy stood apart from the power-centred diplomacy of his age. At a time when empires measured success through territory, influence, and military display, Gladstone insisted that international conduct must be judged by moral standards as well as strategic gain. He rejected the idea that foreign policy was a realm exempt from ethical responsibility. For him, the actions of a state abroad revealed its character just as clearly as its laws at home. This belief shaped a diplomatic vision that was principled, controversial, and often deeply unsettling to more traditional policymakers. Central to Gladstone's moral diplomacy was the conviction that national power carried moral limits. He argued that Britain's strength imposed obligations rather than privileges, especially toward weaker nations and subject peoples. Military intervention, in his view, could only be justified when it served clear moral purposes, such as preventing oppression or defending basic human rights. He was deeply uneasy with imperial expansion for its own sake, believing that domination disguised as stability ultimately corrupted both ruler and ruled. This stance often placed him in direct conflict with advocates of aggressive imperial policy, who saw restraint as weakness rather than responsibility. Gladstone's foreign speeches reflected this ethical framework with unusual intensity. He addressed international crises not merely in terms of interest, but of justice, appealing to public conscience rather than national pride. His denunciations of atrocities and abuses abroad resonated strongly with popular audiences, even when they complicated diplomatic relations. Critics accused him of moral idealism detached from reality. Supporters saw in his words a rare attempt to humanize international politics. Gladstone accepted the cost of this approach, believing that silence in the face of injustice was itself a political act, one he refused to commit. William Ewart Gladstone's later premiership stand as a remarkable testament to political longevity in an era defined by rapid change and generational turnover. Returning to office after periods of defeat and opposition, Gladstone defied expectations that age or controversy would diminish his authority. Each return carried a different political climate, yet he adapted without abandoning his core convictions. Rather than presenting himself as a relic of earlier struggles, he re-entered leadership as a figure shaped by experience. More reflective, more contested, but no less determined. What distinguished these later terms was the tension between endurance and opposition. Gladstone governed in a political environment increasingly fragmented by party divisions, shifting public opinion and rising social demands. Leadership required constant negotiation, not only with rivals but within his own ranks. He faced criticism from those who believed his moral seriousness belonged to another age, and from others who felt his reforms did not go far enough. Yet his persistence itself became a form of authority. Survival in politics, he demonstrated, was not about consistency of popularity, but consistency of purpose. Age did not temper Gladstone's intensity. On the contrary, his later premierships were marked by extraordinary energy and intellectual engagement. He continued to dominate parliamentary debate, often outworking younger colleagues and opponents alike. His speeches retained their density and passion, demanding attention rather than entertainment. For supporters, this endurance symbolised integrity and resolve. For critics, it signalled inflexibility. Gladstone accepted both judgments, believing that leadership was not about comfort, but responsibility carried to its final limits. William Ewart Gladstone's retirement from active politics did not mark a withdrawal from public life, but a redirection of his energies. Stepping away from the pressures of office, he entered a phase defined by reflection, scholarship, and sustained intellectual engagement. Freed from the immediate demands of government, Gladstone turned to writing not as a pastime, but as a continuation of his lifelong dialogue with history, morality, and power. Retirement for him was not silence, it was a different form of participation. Writing became the central expression of this final chapter. Gladstone devoted himself to theology, classical studies, history, and political thought, producing works that reveal the same intensity that had once dominated Parliament. He approached books with the seriousness of policy and arguments with the rigour of legislation. His studies of Homer, religious doctrine, and ethical philosophy reflected a belief that ideas shaped civilizations long before laws did. These writings were not detached academic exercises. They were extensions of his conviction that intellectual clarity and moral responsibility were inseparable. His intellectual life during retirement was marked by remarkable discipline. Gladstone maintained demanding routines of reading and writing well into old age, astonishing contemporaries with both his productivity and stamina. Visitors encountered not a retired statesman seeking rest, but a mind still actively wrestling with enduring questions. He corresponded widely, engaging with scholars, clergy, and political thinkers, and remained alert to developments in public affairs even when he no longer sought to influence them directly. Thought, for Gladstone, was itself a form of service. William Ewart. Gladstone's death marked the end of an era in British public life. When he passed away in 1898, the reaction was not simply one of national mourning, but of historical reckoning. Gladstone had dominated political debate for more than half a century, and his absence left a silence that felt unusually heavy. Newspapers, political rivals, and ordinary citizens alike recognised that they were witnessing the departure of a figure whose influence could not be measured solely by offices held or laws passed. His death symbolised the closing of a 19th century political culture defined by moral argument, parliamentary intensity, and personal conviction. Reputation followed him into death with complexity rather than unanimity. To admirers, Gladstone was the embodiment of conscience in politics, a leader who believed that power must answer to ethics, and who was willing to sacrifice popularity for principle. To critics, he was exhausting, inflexible, and overly moralistic, a man whose intensity sometimes destabilised parties and governments alike. Yet even his opponents rarely questioned his sincerity. What distinguished Gladstone was not agreement, but seriousness. He forced politics to justify itself in moral terms, and in doing so he raised the standard by which leadership was judged. Historically, Gladstone's legacy resists simplification. He was not a consistent ideologue, nor a smooth pragmatist. His career was defined by evolution, sometimes painful, often controversial, but always driven by reflection rather than expedience. He reshaped liberalism into a moral project, redefined the role of the Prime Minister as a public moral voice, and insisted that foreign and domestic policy alike be subject to ethical scrutiny. While many of his causes achieved only partial success in his lifetime, the language and framework he introduced endured far beyond him. In the long view of history, Gladstone stands less as a symbol of victory than of responsibility. He demonstrated that leadership could be rooted in conscience, without surrendering seriousness or authority. His life showed that politics need not abandon moral struggle, even when it complicates success. Remembered today, Gladstone is not revered because he always prevailed, but because he insisted that power must explain itself to Parliament, to the people, and to history. That insistence remains his most enduring legacy, a reminder that political greatness can lie not in certainty or dominance, but in the courage to govern with principles that refuse to fade quietly into convenience.